They say some stories are better left untold. But in the quiet hills of West Virginia, there's one that refuses to stay buried. A story of a family that time tried to erase, and a secret that America has tried not to look at for nearly a century. Imagine walking down a dirt road that ends in silence. No birds, no traffic, just the sound of your own heartbeat. The air feels heavier there, like it's holding something it shouldn't. And then you see them. The Whitakers, a family that shouldn't exist. And yet they do. Most people's first reaction isn't curiosity. It's fear. Not because the Whitakers are dangerous, but because they represent something deeply human, something we all hide from. They are the mirror image of what happens when isolation, poverty, and bloodline intertwine too long. When generations fold inward, what you see in their eyes isn't madness, it's memory. The Whitakers live in a small town called Odd, tucked away in the folds of Appalachia. Even the name sounds like a warning. For decades, they've existed on the edge of society. A family so isolated that they became a legend, a whisper told in gas stations and truck stops across the state. No one could confirm what was real. No one wanted to go there. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one until one man did. A filmmaker named Mark Laita drove into the hills in search of America's forgotten families. But what he found that day would change the way people saw poverty, family, and humanity itself. His footage of the Whitakers would go viral, haunting millions. The world watched, but few understood what they were truly seeing. This isn't just the story of one family. It's a story about how history buries its mistakes, how generations of suffering can twist into something unrecognizable. The Whitakers aren't monsters. They're the result of something much darker, something America doesn't like to talk about. Because behind every forgotten family, there's a chain of decisions made by people who looked away. The Whitakers are just the last link in that chain, and if you follow it far enough back, you'll find a truth that no one wants to admit. A truth about blood, about inheritance, about the hidden cost of being forgotten. When you trace the Whitaker family's history, you begin to realize it didn't start with horror. It began with love, or what people thought was love. Generations ago, the family settled in the hills of Raleigh County. Like many who lived there, they were poor, uneducated, and cut off from the rest of the world. The mountains gave them shelter but also sealed them in. Over time, the outside world stopped coming. Roads decayed, schools shut down, and the map forgot them. And when the world forgets you, you start to forget the world. In small Appalachian haulers, families often married close to home, cousins, sometimes even siblings, bound not by choice but by necessity. Poverty doesn't leave room for options. It was never about desire, it was survival. The Whitakers, like many others, fell victim to isolation's slow curse. The gene pool shrank, birth defects began appearing, and what started as a small, proud family line slowly turned inward on itself. Locals whispered about them for decades. The Eambird family from Odd. They became a ghost story, a warning to kids who wandered too far up the wrong road. But the truth was far more human than the rumors. The Whitakers didn't ask for this legacy. They inherited it, a cycle of isolation, of limited choices, of generations trapped by geography and neglect. The government never intervened. No outreach programs, no healthcare visits. No one asked questions because no one wanted the answers. For America, it was easier to let certain families disappear, to call them hill people, degenerates, the forgotten. Because if you can label them as something less than human, you don't have to feel guilty about abandoning them. When Mark Laita first met them, what struck him wasn't their condition, it was their loyalty. The Whitakers protected one another fiercely. When he asked questions, they didn't answer with words. They barked, they grunted, they used gestures, sounds that seemed animal to outsiders, but in truth, it was their language, their way of communicating after generations of cognitive decline. It wasn't monstrous. It was tragic, and still they smiled, they laughed together. They showed kindness to a stranger holding a camera. In their world, there was no shame, only family. The Whitakers became a living relic of what happens when society abandons its own. Not evil, not cursed, but fossilized. A portrait of what humanity looks like when left to erode in silence. After that first encounter, the footage spread like wildfire. Millions clicked, watched, recoiled, then watched again. The internet couldn't look away. Some viewers called the video disturbing. Others said it was heartbreaking. But beneath every comment, there was an unease no one wanted to name. People weren't horrified by the Whitakers themselves, they were horrified by what the Whitakers represented. For most, the footage was a curiosity, a digital freak show in high definition. But for others, it was something else entirely, a mirror. In the Whitakers' eyes, you could see what happens when compassion disappears. Their lives were proof that progress isn't a straight line. It's a fragile illusion. Strip away education, healthcare, connection, and we all go back to something primal. What makes this story even more haunting is the town's silence. People in awe knew about the Whitakers. They'd seen them, heard them, even helped them at times. But help only went so far. Food here, clothes there. Never enough to lift them out, just enough to keep them alive. Generations passed under that quiet neglect, until eventually the abnormal became normal. Mark would later describe the moment he first saw the Whitakers as stepping into another world. He wasn't exaggerating. Their home was a collapsing structure with no running water, surrounded by debris that once held meaning, a broken chair, an old doll, a rusted tricycle. Time stood still there. You could almost hear the past breathing. But what he didn't expect was the warmth. Beneath the confusion, beneath the decay, there was tenderness. When one of the family members barked to warn the others, it wasn't aggression, it was protection. Family was all they had left, and they guarded it like a flame in the dark. And maybe that's the most disturbing truth of all. Because in the Whitakers, you don't just see genetic decay, you see loyalty untouched by civilization. You see the human instinct stripped bare. Their story forces you to ask, who's truly broken? The family who stayed together in the face of oblivion, or the world that watched them fall and did nothing? In the years following the video's release, the Whitakers' story began to spread far beyond the Appalachian hills. Documentaries, interviews, online forums, everyone had an opinion. Some viewers called for help, for medical care, for intervention. Others mocked them, reducing a century of suffering to memes and reaction clips. Once again, the world did what it always does with pain. It consumed it. But beneath the noise, something deeper emerged. People began asking the right questions. How does a family like this come to exist in modern America? How does an entire community vanish from the system's radar? The answer lies in a truth no one wants to admit: neglect can be inherited. Poverty can become a bloodline. And when a nation looks away long enough, suffering stops being an accident, it becomes a tradition. The Whitakers didn't choose this isolation. It was handed down like an heirloom, wrapped in silence and passed through generations. Their ancestors lived in an era when marrying within the family wasn't uncommon among rural settlers. Distance and poverty meant choices were few, and over time, what began as a single desperate decision became a pattern set in stone. Each generation lost something: language, mobility, education, until what was left was survival in its rawest form. And through all of it, the hills kept their secret. No one came knocking, no reporters, no doctors, not until it was far too late. When Mark returned years later, he found the Whitakers changed, older, frailer, but still together. They recognized him, even smiled. It was a strange kind of reunion, the modern world meeting the remnants of another. You could feel the weight of history in that moment. Not the history in textbooks, but the kind that hides behind closed doors and overgrown fences. And maybe that's why the footage haunted so many. Because it showed what America doesn't want to see, the side of progress that never reached everyone. The Whitakers became a living reminder that beneath the surface of the world's richest nation, entire families can still fall through the cracks and keep falling for generations. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? When you look past the shock, the Whitaker story isn't just about genetics or isolation. It's about what happens when a society defines worth by normality. Every laugh at their expense, every viral share, every whispered, "Look at them." It's proof of how deeply we fear what doesn't fit the mold. We call them normal, but that word hides a darker truth. It's a word we use when we want to feel safe from what they remind us of, because deep down, the Whitakers expose something universal. Strip away the lights, the internet, the comfort of civilization, and what's left? People, families, the instinct to survive together, even when the world forgets your name. Their story isn't distant history, it's a reflection of what we all could become if the world stopped looking our way. There's a certain look in their eyes that people can't stop talking about. Wide, unfocused, haunted. But if you stare long enough, you'll see something else there: trust, innocence. The kind of unfiltered humanity we spend our whole lives trying to disguise. They aren't the monsters of urban legend. They are the result of generations trying to make do with what little they had. And in a way, that's what makes this story so unbearable. Because it's honest. The Whitakers never asked to be the face of on-breeding in America. They never asked to be studied, pitied, or filmed. They just existed quietly as they always had, and maybe that's why the world was so disturbed. Not because of how they looked or spoke, but because their existence punctured the illusion of progress. We like to think humanity has evolved past this kind of suffering. The Whitakers prove we haven't. Their home is more than a place. It's a monument to neglect. Every broken wall and rotting board is a record of years when someone could have stepped in but didn't. When their story surfaced, it wasn't just a revelation, it was an indictment. Not of them, but of us. Because the Whitakers didn't fail society. Society failed the Whitakers. There's a strange stillness in odd West Virginia. A kind of silence that doesn't belong to this century. It clings to the air, to the trees, to the house where the Whitakers still live. Visitors describe it as suffocating, like walking into a memory that refuses to fade. You can almost feel the generations stacked on top of one another, each one more faded than the last. When you stand there, it's hard not to think about time, about how history doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it loops back on itself, over and over, until the past becomes the present. That's what happened here. The Whitakers are living proof that time can trap you, that some families never get to start over. You can't watch them and not feel something shift inside you. Maybe pity, maybe guilt, maybe fear, because the truth is, the Whitakers are not as far removed from us as we'd like to believe. They're what happens when generations of neglect converge in one bloodline. And if you peel back the layers of any country's history, even America's, you'll find countless forgotten families just like them. Families swallowed by geography, poverty, shame. Their story is not just about inbreeding or dysfunction. It's about abandonment, by systems, by neighbors, by the collective conscience of a nation that prefers to romanticize its mountains rather than acknowledge what's buried in them. The haunting part isn't the way they look. It's the realization that nothing about their story had to happen. Every tragedy, every loss of language, every generation born with fewer choices, all of it was preventable. But no one came. No one ever comes for people like the Whitakers. And yet, even in that isolation they endure. There's something unbreakable in their persistence, a quiet defiance in their survival. Maybe it's not purity of blood that keeps them alive, but purity of bond. The kind that outlasts shame and judgment. Because when the world turned its back, they turned toward each other. And maybe that's why their story lingers long after the video ends. It's not a horror story. It's a warning. Whispered from a forgotten house in the hills. There's a moment when you finish watching the footage, when the silence that follows feels almost unbearable. It's as if the world around you suddenly feels too clean, too organized, and you start to realize just how fragile that order really is. The Whitakers aren't some distant anomaly. They're a consequence, a reflection of what happens when the line between civilization and decay grows thin. Look long enough, and their story becomes something more than tragedy. It becomes prophecy. Because the truth is, every generation risks becoming its own version of the Whitakers in ways far less visible. Maybe not through blood, but through ignorance, isolation, and indifference. Every time we choose not to see, not to care, not to reach out, we build another house like theirs, somewhere in the dark. The Whitakers' bloodline might one day end, but their shadow won't. It lingers as a reminder that America's wounds don't heal on their own. You can pave roads, build schools, connect towns with fiber optic lines, but you can't fix what you refuse to face. The Whitakers are proof that the ghosts of the past aren't buried. They're breathing, waiting, watching from forgotten places where the map stops drawing lines. And maybe that's why people keep watching their story, even when it hurts, because deep down, we sense the truth, that the distance between their world and ours is thinner than we want to believe. They remind us of the fragility of progress, the impermanence of comfort, the way civilization teeters on the edge of forgetting its own. In the end, the Whitakers' story isn't about horror or fascination, it's about inheritance, not just theirs but ours. The inheritance of silence, of looking away, of building walls around the parts of humanity we don't want to see. Somewhere in Odd, the family still sits on that same porch, framed by hills that have seen everything. The wind moves through the trees. The house creaks. The camera is gone now. The world's attention has drifted elsewhere. But they remain unchanged, forgotten again. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. Not that the Whitakers exist, but that we allowed them to.